Mr. Beast videos for every US state, let's get it. If you want to participate, hit the like and subscribe button. Creating an all-YouTuber football team in Alabama. Spending 50 hours encased in ice in Alaska. Last to fall off their cactus gets $100,000 in Arizona. Last one to leave the mines get $100,000 in Arkansas. In California, the first one to ride all the rides in Disneyland gets 75 grand. Racing to the top of a mountain on a hoverboard in Colorado. In Connecticut, last to leave the helicopter gets to keep it. First person to scooter across Delaware gets $100,000. Taking 100 alligators into Disney World in Florida. In Georgia, the last to leave the elevator gets 100,000 peaches. 50-hour challenge in a volcano in Hawaii. In Idaho, the first team to eat 1,000 potatoes gets $100,000. For no other reason other than there's nothing in Idaho besides potatoes. Last one to get mugged in Chicago gets $100,000 in Illinois. In Indiana, racing tractors 100 miles down the highway for 75 grand. In Iowa, floating down the whole Mississippi River in a tube. In Kansas, buying 100 farms and giving them away to strangers. In Kentucky, the first person to get a horse into space wins $100,000. Breaking the record for the world's biggest party in Louisiana. In Maine, last one to leave the Atlantic Ocean gets a cruise ship. In Maryland, first one to catch 1,000 lobsters gets $100,000. Burning down an entire college and buying them a new one in Massachusetts. In Michigan, the first person to swim across all the Great Lakes gets $100,000. Breaking the record for the world's largest snow fort in Minnesota. In Mississippi, performing a kidney transplant blindfolded for $200,000. Last to leave the top of the Gateway Arch wins $100,000 in St. Louis, Missouri. In Montana, 24-hour challenge on a moose. Digging a 1,000-foot hole and filling it with beans in Nebraska. I forgot this was a real state. In Nevada, first one to find their way out of the desert gets $100,000 in gold. Last to leave the lighthouse gets to keep it in New Hampshire. In New Jersey, taping myself to a billboard and letting strangers throw tomatoes at me. Hot air balloon racing in New Mexico, winner gets a blimp. In New York, the last to leave the top of the Statue of Liberty gets to keep it. In North Carolina, adopting every child in an orphanage and giving them minimum wage jobs at Mr. Beast Burger. In North Dakota, filling a pool with honey and competing in water sports for $100,000. In Ohio, building a plane the size of the Titanic. Last to leave the national park gets to keep it in Oklahoma. In Oregon, filling Crater Lake with $100,000 worth of food dye. In Pennsylvania, last to leave the giant pool of chocolate gets to keep the chocolate factory. First person to ride a horse across the entire state of Rhode Island wins $100,000 for their parents. In South Carolina, filling a stranger's house with sand and buying them a new one. In South Dakota, last to leave the top of Mount Rushmore gets their head carved into it. Last to stop listening to country music wins $100,000 in Tennessee. Whoever can move a herd of cattle across Austin, Texas gets $100,000. In Utah, surviving on a mountain for 24 hours blindfolded challenge. In Vermont, last to leave the pool of maple syrup gets to keep the forest. And in Virginia, hosting the first official YouTuber Thanksgiving. In Washington, last to stay standing in the rain gets $100,000. In West Virginia, making a house in a mountain only with Minecraft tools. Making a giant water park, but instead of using water, using dairy in Wisconsin. In Wyoming, breaking the record for highest launched person out of a geyser. If you want more content like this, like and subscribe, and if you could, drop your favorite state idea in the comments. Until next time, stay rad.